Hey guys, how are you today? Quick rant before we dive into today's chaos. As some of you might have noticed, YouTube's algorithm has decided I'm not special anymore. Shocking, I know. So now if you don't like, comment, or do a little backflip in the algorithm's honor, this video might just vanish into the void, never to be seen again. Seriously though, even a hi or "this is wild" in the comments helps way more than you think. It tells YouTube, hey, people actually like this channel. Maybe don't hide it from everyone. That can really help push my videos out to a wider audience, not just to my subscribers. So if you enjoy these stories and want to support the channel, that's the best way to do it. Now grab a drink, get comfy, and enjoy the drama. You won't want to miss this one. I never thought much about Aunt Lydia. She was my mom's older sister, and while she was a quiet presence in the background of my life, we weren't close. To hear my parents tell it, she was the oddball of the family, aloof, eccentric, and stubbornly independent. Growing up, I only saw her at a few family gatherings. She wasn't warm or overly affectionate, but she wasn't unkind either. My parents claimed she had always favored them, showering them with lavish gifts and support whenever they needed it. They spoke of her like they had her wrapped around their little fingers. So, when Aunt Lydia passed away last month, I didn't expect to be involved in any meaningful way. I figured my parents would handle the arrangements and, as usual, boast about the inheritance they would receive. I didn't even attend the funeral. It was out of state, and I couldn't afford the time off from work or the travel costs. Truth be told, I didn't feel much grief. How could I when she'd always been so distant? Imagine my shock when a letter arrived from her lawyer a week later. At first, I thought it was a mistake. The envelope was thick, stamped with an official seal and addressed to me. I opened it hesitantly, skimming through the legal jargon until my eyes landed on the part that made my stomach drop. Lydia had left her entire estate to me. Her entire estate. I read the words over and over, unable to believe it. There must have been some kind of error. Why would she leave anything to me, let alone everything? I was just her niece, someone she barely acknowledged. I wasn't even in her life. The only people she was close to, if you could call it, that were my parents. I called the lawyer immediately to clarify. He confirmed it without hesitation. My aunt had updated her will 5 years ago, naming me as the sole beneficiary. She had assets worth a small fortune, a paid-off house, substantial savings, investments, and a few personal items of significant value. He explained that she had left specific instructions for me to take my time and decide what to do with everything. But ultimately it was mine. For a moment I felt paralyzed. This kind of thing didn't happen to people like me. I was a struggling 28-year-old, working 2 part-time jobs just to stay afloat. My parents had never helped me financially or emotionally, and I'd spent most of my life feeling like an afterthought in my own family. Now, suddenly, I was holding a lifeline in my hands, one that could change everything. But the euphoria didn't last long. My parents found out almost immediately. It started with a phone call from my mom. She sounded chipper, almost giddy, asking how I was doing and whether I'd received any interesting news lately. I knew she already knew. I could feel it in her tone. I answered cautiously, admitting that I'd received a letter from Aunt Lydia's lawyer. Her response was instant. She laughed and said it was about time Aunt Lydia got her affairs in order. She asked how much the estate was worth, already assuming I had no claim to it. When I hesitated, she pressed harder, her voice turning sharp. She demanded to know what the lawyer had told me. I told her the truth. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she exploded. She accused me of lying, of trying to swindle the family out of what was rightfully theirs. My dad was yelling in the background, his voice muffled but furious. They were both ranting about how Aunt Lydia would never do something like this, how it must be a mistake, and how I had no business keeping money that belonged to them. She was our sister, not yours. My mom snapped, her voice trembling with anger. You have no right to her estate. She only left it to you because you manipulated her somehow. You'd better do the right thing and hand it over. Family comes first. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Manipulated her. I barely even spoke to Aunt Lydia. I reminded my mom of that, but she wasn't interested in logic. She kept repeating that it wasn't fair, that Aunt Lydia must have been confused when she wrote the will, and that I owed it to them to correct this injustice. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, texts, and even an unannounced visit from my parents. They weren't just angry, they were livid. My dad demanded that I sign over the inheritance immediately, claiming that it was their birthright. He kept bringing up how hard they'd worked to raise me, how much they'd sacrificed, and how ungrateful I was being by even considering keeping the money. I tried to stay calm, but their constant badgering was exhausting. Every time I stood my ground, they turned up the guilt. They said I was tearing the family apart, that I was being greedy, and that I'd regret it if I didn't do the right thing. At one point, my dad said, "You think this money is yours, but it's not. It's ours. She was our sister, not yours. What would people think of you if they knew you were stealing from your own parents?" I was stunned. Stealing? The audacity of it was almost laughable, but there was nothing funny about the way they were treating me. For the first time, I saw just how entitled and manipulative they could be. I didn't have the strength to argue anymore, so I told them I needed time to think. That wasn't good enough for them, but it was the only way to get them out of my apartment. After they left, I sat down and cried. Not because I felt guilty because I didn't, but because I realized how little they valued me as a person. This inheritance wasn't just money. It was a chance for me to live a stable life. And no matter how much they tried to guilt-trip me, I wasn't going to let them take that away. As I wiped my tears and took a deep breath, I made a decision. If they thought they could scare me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. Update. The next morning, I woke up to find dozens of missed calls and text messages from my parents. My mom had even gone as far as leaving a few voicemails, each one more dramatic than the last. In one, she was sobbing, saying she couldn't believe how I was betraying the family. In another, her voice was cold and cutting, accusing me of being selfish and ungrateful. My dad had left a shorter, angrier message, threatening to involve lawyers if I didn't make this right. I ignored all of it. Instead, I focused on getting in touch with Aunt Lydia's lawyer. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with before things escalated further. The lawyer, Mr. Clark, was patient and professional, explaining everything in detail. Aunt Lydia's will was airtight, and she had left clear instructions about her intentions. She wanted me, and only me, to inherit her estate. When I asked him why she'd chosen me, he hesitated before answering. He said that Aunt Lydia had spoken highly of me in their meetings, describing me as hardworking and kind. Apparently, she had been keeping tabs on me over the years, even though we hadn't been close. I was stunned. All those times I thought she was distant and indifferent. She had actually been paying attention. Mr. Clark added that Aunt Lydia had been disappointed in how my parents treated me. She felt they were entitled and dismissive, and didn't appreciate the sacrifices I'd made to support myself. It was a lot to process. I'd spent my whole life feeling overlooked and undervalued. Yet, here was someone who had quietly seen my struggles and wanted to make a difference. The thought brought tears to my eyes. After the call, I felt a renewed sense of determination. Aunt Lydia had chosen me for a reason, and I wasn't going to let my parents bully me into giving up her legacy. But standing up to them wasn't going to be easy. That afternoon, I got another knock on my door. This time, it was my older cousin, Sarah, who I hadn't seen in years. She was my parents' favorite niece and had always been their golden child. Growing up, I was constantly compared to her how she was prettier, smarter, more successful. I wasn't surprised that they'd sent her to talk to me. Sarah wasted no time getting to the point. She said she'd heard about Aunt Lydia's will and wanted to help me see reason. She claimed my parents were devastated and that I was being cruel by refusing to share the inheritance with them. She said my mom had been crying nonstop and my dad was losing sleep over the betrayal. Then she leaned in, her tone dripping with condescension, and said it wasn't too late to fix things. "You have to understand," Sarah told me. Aunt Lydia must have been confused. She probably didn't realize the strain this would put on the family. You don't want to be the cause of a permanent rift, do you? I couldn't help but laugh. I asked her if my parents had ever considered how their behavior might have affected me. Did they think about the rift they created when they constantly put me down, ignored my needs, and made me feel like I didn't matter? Sarah looked uncomfortable, but kept pushing. She said I was being too emotional and needed to think logically. She even suggested that I give my parents a reasonable portion of the inheritance to keep the peace. It was infuriating. She was treating me like a child who didn't understand the consequences of my actions, when in reality, I understood them all too well. My parents had spent years undermining my confidence, making me feel small, and now they wanted me to hand over the one thing that could finally give me some independence. I told Sarah that I wasn't interested in negotiating. Aunt Lydia's will was clear, and I had no intention of going against her wishes. If my parents had a problem with that, they could take it up with a lawyer. Sarah left in a huff, muttering something about how I was making a big mistake. I didn't care. The next few days were eerily quiet. My parents stopped calling and texting, and for a moment, I thought they might have given up, but deep down, I knew better. Sure enough, the calm didn't last long. One morning, I woke up to a barrage of notifications on my phone. My mom had posted a long emotional rant on Facebook, accusing me of stealing the inheritance and tearing the family apart. She painted herself as the victim, claiming that Aunt Lydia had been mentally unstable when she wrote the will and that I was taking advantage of her confusion. The post was filled with lies, but it didn't matter. My parents' friends and extended family members immediately jumped to their defense, flooding the comments with messages of support. They called me greedy, selfish, and heartless, saying I was betraying my own parents for money. It was humiliating. I hadn't even told most people about the inheritance, and now my personal business was being dragged into the spotlight. At first, I felt a wave of panic. I didn't know how to respond, or if I should respond at all. But as I read through the comments, something shifted. These people didn't know me. They didn't know the sacrifices I'd made to survive, or the years of emotional neglect I'd endured from my parents. They were judging me based on a one-sided narrative. And I realized I didn't owe them anything, not an explanation, not an apology, nothing. Instead of engaging with the post, I called Mr. Clark again. I told him about the situation and asked for his advice. He reassured me that my parents had no legal claim to the inheritance, no matter how much noise they made. He also suggested that I document everything, every call, text, and visit, just in case they tried to escalate things further. His calm, practical approach helped me focus. I couldn't control what my parents said or did, but I could control how I responded. I decided to block my mom on Facebook and set my profile to private. I also reached out to a few close friends to let them know what was going on, so they wouldn't be blindsided by the drama. Their support meant the world to me. The next time my parents tried to contact me, I was ready. I didn't answer their calls, but I sent them a text saying that any further communication would need to go through Mr. Clark. They didn't take it well. My dad sent a furious response, accusing me of being disrespectful and threatening to cut me out of the family. My mom followed up with a tearful voicemail, begging me to reconsider, but I wasn't going to budge. I was in control. Update 2. The fallout from my mother's Facebook tirade spiraled quickly. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years messaged me to ask what was going on, while distant relatives jumped into the fray to either criticize or support me. After some reflection, I realized that this was exactly what my parents wanted: control through humiliation. I refused to give them that satisfaction. After consulting with Mr. Clark, we decided to take action. He suggested filing a defamation suit against my parents, given the outright lies they had spread online. It wasn't about the money at Lydia's inheritance had left me more than secure, but about setting boundaries and making it clear that they couldn't bully me into submission. When I gave him the green light, Mr. Clark acted swiftly. A formal notice was sent to my parents outlining the defamatory statements they had made and demanding a public retraction and apology. If they refused, we would proceed to court. As expected, my parents were livid. My mother called me in hysterics, screaming about how I was destroying the family. My father left a scathing voicemail, accusing me of being heartless and warning that I'd regret my actions. I didn't respond to either of them. Then came the begging. A few days later, Sarah showed up unannounced at my doorstep. Her usually confident demeanor replaced by nervousness. She tried to guilt-trip me, saying that suing my parents was crossing the line and that I needed to consider how this was affecting their health. I wasn't moved. I told her that if they were so concerned about their health, They should have thought about the consequences of their actions before spreading lies about me online. Sarah didn't like that answer. She shifted tactics, claiming that I was overreacting and that the family could settle this privately. She even suggested that I could have my parents apologize in person, rather than dragging them through the humiliation of a public apology. I laughed bitterly and told her it was too late for that. For years, they had treated me like an afterthought, dismissing my feelings and prioritizing their own desires. Now, they were finally facing the consequences of their behavior, and I wasn't going to back down. When Sarah realized I wasn't budging, she tried one last desperate move. She brought up Aunt Lydia, suggesting that my aunt wouldn't have wanted this kind of conflict in the family. I cut her off, reminding her that Aunt Lydia had left her fortune to me for a reason. I wasn't going to let anyone disrespect her memory by turning her final wishes into a bargaining chip. The next day, Mr. Clark informed me that my parents wanted to settle. They had realized they didn't have a strong defense and were eager to avoid the embarrassment of a court case. I expected them to negotiate, but instead, they agreed to Mr. Clark's conditions without much resistance. The conditions were simple. They had to issue a public apology on social media, retracting their false statements and acknowledging the harm they had caused. Additionally, they would pay me $4,000 in damages, not because I needed the money, but as a symbolic gesture to show that their actions had consequences. But I wasn't done yet. I told Mr. Clark I had one more condition. If Sarah wanted to play mediator, she could start by apologizing to me personally. And I didn't want a half-hearted apology either. I wanted her to kneel. Mr. Clark was taken aback, but he agreed to include the demand in the settlement. My reasoning was simple. Sarah had spent years bullying me, making snide comments about my appearance, my choices, and my achievements. She had always been my parents' golden child, even though she was just their niece, basking in their praise while I was treated like an outsider. If she wanted to defend them so passionately, she could show me the same level of humility they were being forced to display. When Sarah heard about my demand, she was furious. She called me yelling about how humiliating it would be and accusing me of being vindictive. I told her she was welcome to walk away if she didn't want to apologize, but I wouldn't go through with the settlement. If she was going to meddle in my life and side with my parents, she needed to understand that her actions had consequences too. In the end, she agreed. The apology happened a week later in my lawyer's office. My parents looked defeated as they handed me the signed settlement agreement. My mother's eyes were red from crying, and my father avoided making eye contact. Mr. Clark read over the documents to ensure everything was in order before nodding to me. Sarah stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She looked like she wanted to be anywhere else but there. When it was her turn, she hesitated for a moment, glancing at my parents for support. My dad gave her a small nod, and she stepped forward reluctantly. I told her to kneel. Her face flushed with anger, but she didn't argue. Slowly, she lowered herself to the floor, her eyes blazing with resentment. She mumbled an apology, her voice barely audible. I told her to speak up. She repeated herself louder this time, saying that she was sorry for the way she had treated me and for siding with my parents. She admitted that her actions had been hurtful and that she had been wrong to dismiss my feelings. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. For once, I wasn't the one being belittled or dismissed. For once, I was the one holding the power. After the apologies were done, I stood up and walked out without looking back. I didn't need to hear their excuses or their justifications. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their approval, but now I realized that their opinions didn't matter. What mattered was that I had finally stood up for myself. The public apology went live on my parents' social media accounts later that day. It was carefully worded, no doubt, with the help of their lawyer, but it was enough to clear my name. They admitted to spreading false information and acknowledged that their actions had caused me harm. The $4,000 settlement was deposited into my account shortly after. It was a drop in the bucket compared to Aunt Lydia's inheritance, but it wasn't about the money. It was about proving that I wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. As for Sarah, she avoided me after the apology. I heard through relatives that she was embarrassed by the whole ordeal, but I didn't care. She had played her part in my parents' toxic behavior for years, and it was time she faced the consequences. With the legal drama behind me, I finally felt a sense of peace. Aunt Lydia's inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the strength to stand up for myself and demand the respect I deserved. Update 3. When Aunt Lydia left me her entire fortune, it wasn't just money, it was trust. She believed in me to do what was right, to use her legacy in a way that mattered. I didn't take that lightly. Aunt Lydia had been an eccentric, fiercely independent woman who valued integrity, loyalty, and family qualities my parents never seemed to grasp. I wanted to honor her in a way that reflected who she was and what she stood for. At first, I wasn't sure what to do. The sheer numbers were intimidating. While a portion of the money was tied up in investments, there was still an incredible amount at my disposal. I wasn't about to squander it on frivolous luxuries. Aunt Lydia wouldn't have approved of that. And besides, it didn't feel right. I had spent so many years scrimping and saving, carefully budgeting every penny, that the idea of reckless spending made me uneasy. One of the first things I did was secure my own future. I paid off all my debts, including student loans, credit cards, and the small mortgage I had on my modest home. Knowing I was financially free was an incredible weight off my shoulders. I also set up a substantial emergency fund, ensuring I would never have to worry about unexpected expenses again. Next, I turned my attention to Aunt Lydia's home. Her sprawling Victorian estate had been the centerpiece of her life. It was in need of some serious repairs and renovations, but I couldn't bear the thought of selling it or letting it fall into disrepair. I hired a team of professionals to restore the house to its former glory, but I knew this inheritance wasn't just about me. Aunt Lydia's life had been one of quiet generosity. Mr. Clark informed me she had always given what she could, whether it was donating to local food banks, supporting shelters for women, or funding education programs. Continuing that legacy felt like the most natural and meaningful way to honor her. I also made donations to charities Aunt Lydia had supported throughout her life. Local food banks received generous contributions, ensuring families in need wouldn't go hungry. Women's shelters were provided with much-needed funding to offer resources, counseling, and safe spaces for survivors of domestic violence. One of the most personal donations was to a literacy program that helped adults learn to read. Aunt Lydia had volunteered there for years, and I remembered how passionately she spoke about the joy of seeing someone discover the world through books for the first time. Donating in her name felt like bringing her full circle with something she had loved. When word spread about what I was doing with Aunt Lydia's fortune, I wasn't surprised to hear from my parents again. Their entitlement was boundless, and they weren't about to let the inheritance slip through their fingers without trying every angle. This time, though, they had a new tactic. They sent relatives to plead their case. It started with a voicemail from one of my aunts, who barely spoke to me, even on holidays. Her tone was dripping with fake warmth as she talked about how proud Aunt Lydia would be of the donations I had made. Then came the pivot. My parents had mentioned how they were struggling financially, she said. And wouldn't it be wonderful if I could extend some of Aunt Lydia's generosity to them? What rubbish! Struggling financially. Who were they trying to fool? I didn't respond. The next day, a cousin I hadn't seen since I was a teenager sent me a long text. She reminisced about the one time Aunt Lydia took us both out for ice cream, then subtly shifted the conversation to how my parents were going through a tough time. According to her, it was only fair for me to help them since they were still family. I stared at the text for a long time before deleting it. If these people thought they could guilt-trip me into handing over money, they were about to be sorely disappointed. What really got under my skin, though, was how they tried to weaponize family against me. Where was this sense of family when I was growing up being ignored and dismissed by my parents? Where was it when I had to scrape by on my own while my cousin Sarah was pampered and coddled? Now that I had something they wanted, suddenly I was family again. But not all of my relatives were the same. A few cousins, like my father's niece Sophia, had always been kind to me. When I saw how hard Sophia was working to put herself through nursing school, I decided to offer her some help. I reached out to her directly and had a conversation with her. She was hesitant at first, but when I assured her it was Aunt Lydia's money and not my parents', she gratefully accepted. Sophia wasn't the only one. I also helped my cousin Marcus, who had always stuck up for me when we were kids, to pay for his trade school tuition. Both of them were genuinely grateful, and seeing their excitement and relief made me feel like I was doing something meaningful with the inheritance. Of course, word got back to my parents that I was helping Sophia and Marcus. That's when the calls and texts from them started up again. My mother left me a voicemail. I could hear her voice trembling. She said she couldn't believe I was giving money to cousins while my own parents were struggling. She accused me of being selfish and ungrateful and of disrespecting the people who raised me. My father's voicemail was even more direct. He demanded to know why I was helping distant relatives instead of supporting my immediate family. I didn't bother responding to either of them. Their persistence didn't stop there. They started texting me daily, alternating between guilt-tripping me and outright insulting me. My mother said Aunt Lydia would have been ashamed of how I was treating them. My father said I was a heartless daughter who would regret abandoning her family. It was laughable, really. These were the same parents who had ignored me my entire life, who had sided with Sarah even when she bullied me relentlessly, and who only ever saw me as a backup plan when they needed something. They had the audacity to call me heartless. Eventually, they took things a step further. My father called me one night, his voice dripping with anger. He said that if I didn't start supporting them financially, they would have no choice but to tell everyone how ungrateful and cruel I was. I asked him how was the new farmhouse he had just bought. He stopped mid-rant. He stammered. I told him that he would be hearing from my lawyer again and hung up. That was the last straw. I contacted my lawyer the next morning and explained the situation. I told him about the constant calls, the texts, and the way my parents were trying to get money from me through relatives. He listened patiently and then assured me that he would take care of it. Within a week, my lawyer had sent a formal warning to my parents. The letter outlined how their repeated attempts to harass me were unacceptable, and that any further contact would result in legal action. It was clear and firm, and left no room for misinterpretation. I didn't hear from them directly after that, but my aunt called me a few days later, furious. She said I had gone too far by threatening legal action against my own parents. I calmly explained that I had no obligation to tolerate harassment, even from family. If they couldn't respect my boundaries, then I had every right to protect myself. I asked her if she wanted to be next. My parents eventually backed off, but not without one last attempt to paint themselves as victims. They posted a vague message on social media about how ungrateful children forget the sacrifices their parents made. They hadn't learned their lesson. Some relatives chimed in with sympathetic comments, but others who knew the truth defended me. Sophia even commented, saying that Aunt Lydia had made her wishes clear and that I was honoring her memory in the best way possible. Seeing her stand up for me brought tears to my eyes. In the end, my parents' schemes amounted to nothing. They couldn't manipulate me into giving them what they wanted, and they couldn't tarnish my reputation among the people who mattered. I finally had the peace and freedom to live my life on my own terms without their toxic influence weighing me down.